Have you ever had somebody send you an email or a text or Slack message, or maybe even make a little offhanded comment in a meeting, and you immediately went from 0 to 60 in 2 seconds, losing your ability to communicate, often saying or doing something that you regret later? Well, this is called being triggered. In this video, we'll explain what triggers are, how they work, and how to regain our power and ability to communicate when they happen. Hi, I'm Chris Littlefield from Beyond Thank You, and I spent over 15 years helping leaders around the world build and maintain relationships where their people feel valued and appreciated every single day. Let's jump in. Now, the first thing I want to acknowledge is that getting triggered, getting frustrated, getting angry is part of being human, and it's normal. And expressing our frustration, expressing our anger, showing our emotions is critical for us to build and maintain relationships. If you think about it, many of the people that we have the deepest relationships with are some of the ones we fight with the most. And I'll never forget an ex-girlfriend of mine saying, "You fight the hardest with the ones you love the most." And it's true, because we're willing to make that risk, to share that emotion, to share that anger. We just want to be able to do it in a way that's constructive opposed to destructive. And that's why we're specifically working on better understanding triggers and the role they play. Now, it's also important to understand that triggers are part of our biology, right? It's that fight or flight response. We see a threat out in the world, the amygdala gets hijacked, and all of a sudden, all the resources go into that fight or flight response, either protecting ourselves and going at the person, or pulling ourselves back and finding a way to be able to get away. Now, the challenge is many times we have that amygdala get hijacked in a situation where it doesn't necessarily need to be, and we often respond in a way that we regret later. So let's go into understanding the different components of a trigger. Now, the way that I break down triggers in my workshops is into 4 core components. There's the stimulus, there's the interpretation of the stimulus, there's the physical and emotional reaction, and then the triggered response. And all of this happens in under a second. And my basis of understanding on this, what this is based on, is not just off of reading something online, but having worked with hundreds of people who are triggered in the moment. I used to facilitate cross-border dialogue programs between Israelis and Palestinians, or Indians and Pakistanis, or people from Armenia and Azerbaijan, and then also being brought in to help teams that have got toxic dynamics and have stopped communicate, and helping them open those lines of communication. And in that process, I've worked with 100 people who were triggered in the moment, and I was able to pause the conversation, help them understand what triggers are, and then step out of them. So let's go back to that stimulus. The stimulus is maybe somebody says something or does something or looks a certain way, right? And they're doing it over there. Maybe somebody says, "Well, I don't agree with that," in a meeting or whatever, and maybe just has that response. And then our mind sees that and immediately interprets it. They don't value me. They don't respect me. They don't care. Whatever the interpretation is. And then as soon as that happens, that's an interpretation of the stimulus. And then we have a physical and emotional response that happens in our body. And this is one of the most important things for us to understand. Okay, so maybe your chest gets tight, maybe your fists tighten up, maybe you start to sweat a little bit, maybe your cheeks get warm, or your gaze gets hyper-focused into tunnel vision, which is what often happens for people. Some people, their ears get warm, and you're gonna know what those physical responses are for you. Okay? And then once we have that response, which all happens in under a second, then many times as our emotions rise, our ability to communicate goes down, right? Those emotions go up and our vocabulary goes down, and the number of letters and the words we use. Many times it's 4-letter words, okay? And we say something right afterwards without even thinking, okay? And so we cannot stop ourselves from getting triggered. It's gonna happen sometimes, but the more we can be aware of our reactions and what our triggers are, the more we have the ability to step out of them when we have those physical responses. Now, the first step in getting better at managing our triggers is understanding them. So what I want you to do is I want you to think of a time over the last week or month when you went from 0 to 60. Maybe it was something that happened at work or something that happened at home. And I want you to think of, what was the stimulus? What did the other person or other group of people say or do? And you don't want to say they were inappropriate or they were mean. I want you to think, what was the exact wording? Right? What did they do, or what was the behavior? And then what I want you to do is I want you to identify, what did you interpret in that moment? they were mean, they were inappropriate, they didn't value me. Because once you start to understand your interpretation, that's where the gold is, because that is often the situation or circumstance that triggers that physical response. Okay, so find a situation. What was the stimulus? What was my interpretation of the stimulus? And what's important to own is it's our interpretation. And rarely is that the other person's intention to be able to piss us off or make us angry or whatever it is. So you've identified the stimulus, you've identified your interpretation, and then I want you to think about when you get triggered, and many times even thinking of it will bring back that emotion. Where did you feel it in your body? Right? Was it in your chest? Was it in your hands? Was it in your face? And think of a time when you're triggered and think about what are those physical responses for you and jot those down as well. Because once we understand this is how we respond, right, the interpretation happens in a second. But many times when we may be sitting in a meeting, somebody says something, we find our chest getting tightened, we get angry, we're seeing red. And those are the indicators. When we see those, right, we can catch ourselves and go, oh, I just got triggered. Does that mean that all the emotions and frustration are instantly gone? No, of course not. It doesn't work that way. But when we're able to acknowledge I am triggered, whether it's in our mind or out loud to others, it means we're naming the emotional experience we're having, which means we're shifting from an unconscious response, that freight train we're on, to a conscious response, which gives us a couple more choices. Now, what those choices are going to be dependent on our situation. Now, as individuals, we want to have a repertoire of different things we can use when we're triggered, right? Some things I encourage people to do to have in their toolbox is say, hey, I need to go to the bathroom for a second, or I need to go out and get some water, to be able to pull yourself away from that stimulus for a second. Another thing we can do is grounding, which is reconnecting yourself to the physical space you're in and getting out of your mind. That may be putting your hand down on the desk for a second and just feeling what you feel under your hands. Or if I have people who I'm coaching that are going into a difficult conversation, I have them pick a place on their hand. Maybe it's a ring that they're going to touch when they get frustrated, or they're even going to take their nail and push it into their skin, because that physical reaction or that little bit of pain pulls us out of that triggered response as well. But it's having different things that help you calm down and having those at the ready when these situations come up. So if we want to get better at triggers, it's important to first start by understanding what are those stimulus for us? What are those situations? And you can keep a trigger log of every time you get triggered, go back and go, what was the stimulus? What was the interpretation? What were my physical reactions, right? And how did I respond? And many times you have to go back and clean up where we responded in a way that was more destructive than constructive. Okay? And the more you pay attention to your triggers, the less you'll often get triggered. Now, the goal is not to never get triggered, because as I said in the beginning, it's normal. It's part of being human, and it's part of us building and maintaining relationships with others. What the goal is that when we do get triggered, we spend less time over there in that triggered response and more time calming ourselves down, getting back in communication, and continuing to build and maintain those relationships in a constructive way. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did and you're watching on YouTube, please hit like and subscribe and share it with at least one other person you think can make a difference for. And together, let's build cultures where people feel valued every day. Take care.